Hi everyone, this is the first video of 2 for the skeletal system. In this video we're going to cover the functions of bone, the cells and structures that make up bones, and the development of bone. When we think of the skeletal system, our first thoughts often go to support and protection. And the skeletal system definitely protects our brain, it protects our spinal cord, it protects our vital organs, it supports our body and soft tissues and soft organs. It's also very important in movement, right? With our muscles, our bones act as levers so that we can move our body. Something that's probably not at the top of your head when you think of functions of bone is storage, but bone is a super important place for storing minerals like calcium and phosphorus, growth factors, and triglycerides or fat. So the triglycerides are stored within the yellow marrow of long bones. Bone is also the location for blood cell formation, and the name that we use for blood cell formation in anatomy and physiology is called hematopoiesis. Last but not least, bone also produces a really important hormone called osteocalcin. Osteocalcin plays a critical role in maintaining blood sugar balance, metabolism, and a couple years ago, a study came out that showed that osteocalcin actually triggers the fight or flight response in mice. And there's been some data that's been collected since that looks like it also has an effect of triggering fight or flight in humans, although that is not confirmed yet. When we think of bone, we often think of hard structures that don't really seem to be living, but bone is very much alive. In fact, bone has 5 different types of cells that are associated with it. So we're just going to go through those different types of cells and talk about what the function is of each of them. The first type of cell that we're going to look at is called an osteogenic cell. Osteogenic, it means that it is the origin of bone. So osteo means bone, and genic comes from genesis, right, the beginning. And so these are mitotically active stem cells. They're found within the periosteum and the endosteum. And when they're stimulated, they can differentiate into cells called osteoblasts, which we'll touch on in a moment. The most important thing to remember about these is that they go through lots of mitosis and they can turn into or differentiate into bone cells, specified bone cells. Okay, so that's osteogenic cells. The next cells that we're going to talk about are those osteoblasts, and those are over here. Whenever you see the word osteoblast, I want you to think B is for builder, because osteoblasts are the bone building or bone forming cells. They secrete unmineralized matrix that's called osteoid. Most of osteoid is collagen, and it also has some calcium binding proteins. And so while they secrete this unmineralized osteoid, over time, minerals are going to bind to those proteins within the osteoid and harden the bone. Osteoblasts are also actively mitotic, so they can divide, multiply, and continue bone building. The next type of cell we're going to talk about are osteocytes. And osteocytes are actually what happens to an osteoblast after it's kind of enclosed itself into the osteoid. So these osteoblasts are going to be secreting osteoid, but over time they essentially build walls around themselves. And so the osteocytes are what osteoblasts turn into. So these cells are going to maintain the bone matrix. They can sense strain and stress on the bone, and they can respond to that mechanical stimuli. The third type of cell, or fourth type of cell that we're going to look at, are osteoclasts. And so just like with the osteoblasts, and I said you want to remember B for building, for osteoclasts, I want you to remember the C for crushing. Osteoclasts are specialized cells. They actually develop from the same cells that blood cells come from, or the same tissue that blood cells come from. And they differentiate into these macrophages, big eaters, that actually break down the bone. Okay, and so they break down the bone, they can release calcium into the bloodstream. So these are obviously activated by the parathyroid hormone. Okay, and one thing I want you to remember is that we've talked about how in the body, if you need to increase surface area, you can create folds. And look at these folds right here. These folds or ruffled borders increase the surface area of the osteoclast to break down that bone. The last type of cell isn't actually pictured here. They're called bone lining cells, and they're just flat cells that are found on the surfaces of bone. It's believed that they help maintain the matrix of bone along with the osteocytes, and they are found on the outside where the periosteum is, so those are called periosteal cells, and they're also found on the inside where the endosteum is, and so those are called endosteal cells. So the cells are part of the organic components of bone. The cells in the osteoid make up those organic components, and it's about 35% of bone. The other 65% of bone are the inorganic components. These are the hydroxyapatites, and these are the mineral salts that contain calcium and phosphate crystals kind of wrapped around collagen fibers. And these are what make bone hard and resistant to compression. Okay, so when we think of bone, we may not think of it as having a lot of flex, but bone actually is relatively flexible for how strong it is. Bone is about half as strong as steel in resisting compression and as strong as steel in resisting tension. One of the ways that bone does this is there's these really cool sacrificial bonds between collagen molecules. And so those collagen molecules, when bone kind of twists or experiences stress, those sacrificial bonds between the collagen molecules break, but it prevents the bone from breaking. Okay, it dissipates the energy of that torsion. And then those bonds can just reform easily. And so that is, again, one of the ways that our bone is able to prevent fractures from happening, even when we twist and jump and do all the things that we do to our body. It is the mineral part of bone, or the inorganic components, that last long after we are gone. But there's enough material that's left, and the kind of bumps and lines and such that form from muscle pulling over our lifetimes, that our bones can tell us a lot about people who lived before us, can tell us about any injuries that they've had, can tell us about their occupations, their health, whether or not they were malnourished. So our bones tell amazing stories. We're next going to talk about bone development. Bone development happens in two different ways. The first way that we're going to discuss is endochondral ossification. Endo means within, chondral means cartilage, ossification means to harden into bone. So within cartilage hardens into bone. During development, in around week 6 to 8, a hyaline cartilage model of what's going to be our skeleton forms. This hyaline cartilage model develops from tissue that's called mesenchyme that differentiates into cartilage. So that hyaline cartilage model is going to be covered by perichondrium, which is the connective tissue that covers cartilage. And again, we'll have hyaline cartilage in the center. In a couple of weeks, that perichondrium is going to turn into periosteum. So again, periosteum is the connective tissue that covers bone. Okay, within periosteum, there's osteogenic cells, and from a couple of slides ago, we talked about how osteogenic cells are the cells that go through mitosis, and they can differentiate into those bone-building cells called osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts are going to make a bony collar on the diaphysis of the bone, while a primary ossification center starts forming in the center of the bone. So the cartilage is going to be broken down, and it's going to be replaced by this primary ossification center. We're going to get blood vessels working their way into the bone to nourish the inner parts of the bone. And also at the same time, we're going to have secondary ossification centers form. So an ossification center, remember, is just where we get that kind of bone development happening. Okay? Over time, the bone's going to lengthen and ultimately be converted into what we think of as mature bone. So this all starts during fetal development, but doesn't end until childhood / early adolescence. And we'll talk about the lengthening process in the next video. The second type of bone development is called intramembranous ossification. Intra means within, membranous means membrane, ossification means to harden into bone. And so with intramembranous ossification, the bone is going to form within fibrous connective tissue. And so within that fibrous connective tissue, mesenchymal cells, those special stem cells, are going to differentiate into osteoblasts. Once you get a mass of osteoblasts, it's now formed an ossification center where they can deposit osteoid that will be calcified over the course of a few days. Okay, and so we can see here's that ossification center with the osteoblasts secreting osteoid. Over time, the osteoblasts that are in the center get converted into osteocytes, right? Because they're completely surrounded by osteoid. And so their job now is to kind of maintain the mineral balance and also to kind of be a sensor for stress and tension of the bones. But we can still see that on the outside of this, we have lots of osteoblasts that are going to continue to secrete osteoid, allowing the bone to grow bigger. Okay. Another thing that happens is that blood vessels are going to kind of weave their way in to the center of the bone. And we end up with this spongy bone in the center where bone forms around the blood vessels. And we have these columns of trabeculae and lots of blood vessels. Okay? And so what we end up with is a layer of compact bone, a middle of spongy bone, and another layer of compact bone on the other side. And these are going to be lined by osteoblasts while the bone is growing, and over time there's going to be fewer and fewer osteoblasts. I'd like you to spend the next few days really understanding intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. You'll notice on the website on Moodle there is an endochondral ossification card sort within the Chapter 6 notes. And I think that that's a really helpful thing for you to kind of organize the information around endochondral ossification. I give you a very quick explanation here, but that card sort will give you all of the details. Okay, I hope this is helpful, and I will have video 2 up for you in a couple of days.